The Steelman. The Steelman. In November 2018, Tyler Cowen sat down with Paul Krugman in a small studio in New York for the 75th episode of Conversations with Tyler. Cowen is a libertarian-leaning economist at George Mason University. Krugman is a Nobel laureate Keynesian economist who had spent the better part of 2 decades attacking the political and intellectual tradition Cowen represents. They disagreed about almost everything that economists can disagree about: the proper size of the state, the structural causes of inequality, the political economy of the European Union, the role of trade in advanced economies, the appropriate response to financial crises. Cowen's first question was not a challenge. He spent the first 3 minutes of the interview restating Krugman's positions on austerity, on inequality, on the political economy of the dollar, in language Krugman himself had not always used, but that captured the strongest version of what Krugman believed. The restatement was not a paraphrase, it was an upgrade. Cowen articulated, in some places, a version of Krugman's case that was more rigorous and more defensible than the version Krugman typically published in his New York Times columns. Krugman, listening, said something that comes up rarely in adversarial interviews. He said, "Yes, that's right." Then Cowen began to disagree. The disagreement, when it came, was devastating in a way that the interview's polite tempo concealed. Cowen had already demonstrated, by the Steelmaning, that he understood Krugman's position better than most of Krugman's defenders. The disagreement that followed was not the disagreement of someone who had not understood. It was the disagreement of someone who had understood and still disagreed, which is the kind of disagreement a careful audience cannot dismiss as a misreading. Krugman, having confirmed the Steelman, could not retreat to "That's not what I really meant." The position Cowen was attacking had just been ratified by Krugman as the position Krugman held. Whatever Cowen demolished, Krugman could not disown. This is the Steelman, deployed at the level the move is capable of when its full power is understood. It is the second move in the offensive arsenal, the first having been the definition demand from the previous chapter, and it is, by some margin, the move that produces the highest credibility-to-cost ratio in the entire repertoire. It costs almost nothing to deploy. It pays an enormous amount. Most arguers do not deploy it. The reason most arguers do not deploy it is that they have misunderstood what the move is for. The Steelman is the construction of the strongest version of your opponent's case, in language they would accept, on the assumption that the case is a serious one, held for serious reasons by serious people. It is the opposite of the strawman, which is the construction of the weakest version of your opponent's case, in language they would not use, for the purpose of easy refutation. The Steelman is, on the surface, an act of intellectual generosity. This is how it is described in the popular literature, as a habit of mind that fair-minded interlocutors should cultivate, as a sign of a mature intellectual community, as a contrast to the ungenerous interpretations that dominate online discourse. All of this is true, and all of this is beside the point. The Steelman is, beneath the surface, the most powerful offensive move in the dialectical arsenal. It is offensive in 2 specific senses. The first is structural. Once you have stated your opponent's case better than they have stated it themselves, several things become unavailable to them. They cannot accuse you of misunderstanding. You have just demonstrated full understanding. They cannot accuse you of bad faith. You have just demonstrated good faith. They cannot retreat to a stronger version of their case when you attack the weak version. You have already preempted the retreat by attacking only the strong version. They are, in a word, pinned to a position they have ratified, and you are about to refute that position. The second is perceptual. The audience watching the encounter forms an immediate and durable impression of you as the more careful, more honest, more analytically capable of the 2 arguers, because you have done what the audience would have wanted both sides to do. The audience update is large and persistent. Even if your eventual argument is no stronger than the opponent's, the audience tends to side with the steelmaner. This is one of the most reliable findings in the social psychology literature on perceived persuasiveness. The combination is decisive. The opponent is structurally pinned. The audience is already inclined toward you. Then you make your case. The Indian philosophical tradition Shankara was trained in had a name for this. It called the steelman purvapaksha, the prior position, and it required, as a procedural matter, that any sustained philosophical argument include a full, fair, and rigorous statement of the position the author was about to refute. The purvapaksha came first. The uttarapaksha, the responding position, came second. The standard was that the purvapaksha should be stated so well that the proponents of the position would themselves accept the statement. This was not optional. A philosophical text that failed to provide a serious purvapaksha was, by the conventions of the tradition, not a serious text. It would not be read carefully, it would not be commented on, it would not enter the canon. The purvapaksha requirement was the first filter by which the tradition distinguished competent philosophy from sectarian polemic. Shankara's Brahma Sutra Bhashya, his commentary on the Brahma Sutras, the foundational text of Vedanta, runs to several hundred pages of dense Sanskrit philosophy. Approximately a third of the total length, by some scholars' counts, is purvapaksha. He states the Buddhist positions, the Mimamsa positions, the Sankhya positions, the various Vaisheshika and Nyaya positions, the positions of various sub-schools of Vedanta itself. He states each of these in the strongest available form. He cites the canonical texts of each school in their preferred translations with their preferred technical vocabulary. He makes their arguments better than they make them. Then he refutes them. The refutations, when they come, work because the purvapaksha has done the structural work in advance. There is no available retreat. The Buddhist position cannot be saved by saying that wasn't really what we meant. Shankara has already shown that this was what they meant, in the form they themselves would endorse. The Mimamsa position cannot be saved by appeal to a different formulation. Shankara has already considered the strongest formulation. The cage is built before the attack arrives. This is how the Brahma Sutra Bhashya came to dominate the Indian philosophical landscape for the next 1200 years. Other Vedantic philosophers wrote alternative commentaries, Ramanujas, Madhvas, Vallabhas, and these are studied and respected. None of them displaced Shankara's. The reason they did not displace Shankara's is not primarily that Shankara's philosophical conclusions are stronger. Reasonable people in the tradition disagree about that. The reason they did not displace Shankara's is that Shankara's purvapaksha is stronger. He stated the positions he was attacking better than his rivals stated the positions they were attacking. Readers of any persuasion finished the Bhashya convinced, at minimum, that Shankara had understood the alternatives. Many were also convinced that he had refuted them. The combination produced a textual authority that has not been challenged in 12 centuries. The amateur version of the steelman is the technically accurate restatement. The amateur reads what the opponent has written, paraphrases the central claims into different language, attaches the paraphrase to a few of the opponent's vocabulary terms, and presents the result as a fair representation of the opponent's view. This is not the steelman. This is what philosophers call a charitable paraphrase, and while it is better than a strawman, it is not the move we are training for. The master version of the steelman has 3 additional properties. The first is upgrade. The steelman is not a paraphrase of the opponent's case. It is the strongest version the opponent's case is capable of becoming. Most public arguers, including most accomplished public arguers, do not state their positions as well as their positions can be stated. They are constrained by space, by audience expectations, by the rhetorical conventions of their genre, by the political requirements of their tribe, by the time pressure of the medium they are working in. Steelman acknowledges these constraints and removes them. It states the case as the proponent would state it under ideal conditions, with unlimited space, with the most careful interlocutor, and with the rhetorical discipline that the original was missing. The Cohen restatement of Krugman was an upgrade in this sense. Krugman's Times columns are written for non-specialists in 800-word increments. Cohen restated the underlying economic position with the precision and qualification that 800 words cannot accommodate. Krugman recognized the upgrade. He said, yes, that's right. The second is sympathetic vocabulary. The Steelman uses the language the opponent would use, not the language you would use about the opponent. If the opponent says capitalism, you say capitalism. You do not silently substitute the free market system that has produced enormous prosperity or the exploitative regime that immiserates workers, depending on which side you are on. You use the term in the way the opponent uses it, with the connotations the opponent attaches to it. This is harder than it sounds. Most arguers, even when they think they are being fair, smuggle in vocabulary that preloads the case. The Steelman requires a deliberate stripping out of these substitutions. The third is named instance. The Steelman is not abstract. It draws on the specific examples, the specific data, the specific historical events that the opponent's case relies on. The Mimamsa school argues that ritual produces moksha is not a Steelman, it is a paraphrase. The Mimamsa school argues that the Vedic injunctions, properly performed by a qualified practitioner with the requisite mental dispositions, produce, through the apurva mechanism, the karmic conditions that over the appropriate duration generate the conditions sufficient for the dawning of liberation. That is a Steelman. The named instances, the technical vocabulary, the mechanism, the qualifications, all are present. The opponent recognizes the case as theirs. The audience recognizes that you have done the work. These three properties, upgrade, sympathetic vocabulary, named instance, are what distinguish the Steelman from the merely fair paraphrase. They are also what makes the Steelman so hard to fake. A debater who has not done the work cannot produce them. The Steelman is, therefore, also a costly signal, and one of the most efficient ones available. A note on the relationship between the Steelman and the costly signal. We have discussed costly signals, the signals that transmit credibility because they would be too expensive for a non-credible sender to fake. The Steelman is a costly signal in two of the 7 categories of costly signal. It is named instance, the opponent's specific examples and vocabulary deployed correctly, and admitted limit, the implicit acknowledgement that the opponent's position has merit, which is itself a status-reducing admission. This is why the Steelman is so disproportionately powerful. It is not merely an argumentative move. It is a sustained, costly signal that, by the time it has run for 90 seconds, has positioned you in the audience's perception as the more credible, more careful, more honest of the two arguers. The substantive argument that follows the Steelman is being read through this perceptual frame. Even when the substantive argument is comparable in quality to the opponent's, the audience tends to side with the Steelmaner. This is not a manipulation, it is a correct response by the audience to the costly signal you have just paid. Pay it.